Welcome back to Real Cast Fishing. Your host, Glenn, with the City of Allen Fishing Field Team, COAF Field Team, on YouTube. In this round, what have I got for you? We're back to the Little Red Book of Fly Fishing. In this round, we're going through tips 41 through 45. Then we'll go through a little Q&A, as well as just close out with some recent happenings. All right. And the format that I use for this is I take it right out of the Little Red Book of Fly Fishing. We're currently in part 1, focusing on the fly casting piece. And I'll read through the passage or the tip, and then we'll just go in and talk about maybe some key items or key takeaways. All right, so let's get you right into it. Tip 41, what spooks trout? Like many anglers, I often found myself wondering what the fish were actually doing beneath the surface. Eventually, my curiosity got got the better of me. I got some scuba gear, dove into the North Fork of the South Platte River in Colorado, and hung out with the trout to watch and learn what was really going on as a couple of my buddies cast flies at the fish. This Be the Fish experience eventually evolved into a story for Field and Stream magazine called Going Deep in the Name of Trout Research. The most riveting lesson I took away upon resurfacing was that the fish were not startled by my presence among them. I could often get within arm's reach of a feeding trout, and it wasn't bothered one bit by big neon bubble-blowing mass in the water next to it. But any really motion overhead, a bird's shadow, for example, triggered an immediate nervous instinct to scatter or head for deeper water. That also held true for false cast over the fish. As I held onto a boulder on the river bottom, I watched the fish skitter away time and time again after my friends started false casting over the run. With every false cast, the wariness intensified, in effect diminishing the possibility of a hookup with each pass the line made over the water. Think about it that in the context of the shadows you cast and the number of times you false cast, try to keep your false casts to a minimum and direct them slightly outside of the line of fire, bringing only the casts that counts into the target zone. Signed, KD. Okay, some key takeaways here. The individual took some scuba gear and went under the water and watched his buddies pretty much casting to some trout. And what he noticed was they weren't bothered by him in the water making tons of bubbles, and could get within arm's length. But they seemed to, scatter as soon as they got a heavy a splash or the casting of the fly line. Excuse me. So that said, I guess the key takeaway here is be aware of where your shadow is and be aware where you're casting and minimize those false casts. And like it was saying, keep it outside of the line of fire and only bring it into the cast that counts into the target zone. All right. So let's go on to number 42. The hard splashdown isn't so bad. See, I learned a lesson from Terry Gunn of Lee's Ferry Anglers in Arizona one afternoon while we were fishing dry flies at Marble Canyon. It's often better to splash your flies down on the surface than it is to make many false casts and create fluttering shadows from your flies and line over the fish. Think about it. Boom, pop. All of a sudden the fly is there in the fish's feeding lane. Naturally, you do not want to make a lot of commotion. And it's a huge mistake to rip your flies out of the water in close proximity of feeding trout. Mayflies typically don't take off with the force of a water rocket. Ideally, you want to elevate your imaginary bullseye target a foot or two above the surface as if you're casting into a hula hoop suspended inches above the water. You want your line, leader, and fly to reach the full extension and fall gracefully into that zone. I'm going to err on the high side or the low side of that target, however, I'll inevitably err low. Signed, KD. Okay, here they're talking about the hard splashdown isn't so bad. That splash versus a false cast, that commotion or whatnot may actually attract the trout. And then it's far worse to rip the line, rip the fly off the water, with the example being you don't have mayflies just rocketing off the surface and making a large commotion, so those trout will skitter away or be wary of what's landing, or not what's landing, but what's taking off. Excuse me, what's taking off. And so one of the suggestions: aim as if there's a hula hoop above where you're targeting, and get your line, leader, and tippet to go its full extension along with that fly as it hits that zone gracefully, with not so much of a commotion. All right. Well, that was useful. Tip 42. Okay, number 43, make the first cast count. It sounds simple, but after a guide has seen a client throw wildly into a pot of surface-feeding trout a few hundred times to no effect, it's worth repeating that you should make your first cast count as if it were the only and best shot, because oftentimes it is. Excuse me. It's always better to stop, assess, and make the cast you want. Yes, a combination of speed and accuracy is ideal, but if I'm forced to choose one over the other, I always choose accuracy. 99 times out of 100, speed does not, in fact, trump accuracy when you are fly fishing for trout. Okay, another good one to keep in your back pocket is make the first cast count. And I think that's more common sense. If you have a whole bunch of, not so good casts, it's definitely going to spook the fish on you. Okay, let's move on to tip 44. Time your casts. If you make a decent cast and the trout you were after ignores your fly, wait and watch. You'll find that trout eating dry flies are often in a natural rhythm. They feed, pause, they feed right, pause, they feed left, pause, pause more. Then they start over in roughly the same routine. Sync your casting clock with that routine. Use your eyes as much as your arm, and the effectiveness of your cast will improve incrementally. Signed, KD. Okay, so timing your cast. In fact, I kind of remember this just the other day. Excuse me, fishing Waterloo Pond, where there were some actively feeding trout, and I could see that pattern that they were taking. So they feed, pause, and then pop up again. So I probably should have timed my cast for that particular situation. Okay, tip 45, give me a good drift over a good cast any day. Any good guide will tell you the same thing. In trout fishing, the most important 3 seconds are those right before and during the time a fly, dry fly or nymph, excuse me. Okay, I'm having to check something real quick. I jumped over, so bear with me. Dry fly or nymph enter the zone where a trout is eating. Let me do that one over. Tip 45. Give me a good drift over a good cast any day. Any good guide will tell you the same thing. In trout fishing, the most important 3 seconds are those right before and during the time a fly, dry fly, or nymph enters the zone where a trout is eating. In other words, it doesn't matter how you get it there, but when that offering hits the water, it had better look appetizing or you're out of luck. In trout fishing, that means the drift has to be perfect. I don't care if you make a 70-foot flawless cast with a perfect loop, or if you hand toss the fly, fling it, zip it, chuck it, or deliver it by FedEx. Once the fly hits the water, it has to look natural. Period. Give me a good drift over a perfect cast any day, and you'll catch more fish. Promise. Signed, KD. Okay, that was tip 45. Really good stuff again. Give me a good drift over a good cast. So yeah, that flawless 70-foot cast is awesome. But if it's a terrible drift, you're probably not going to get that trout to strike. All right. So that was tips 41 through 45. And in fact, that takes us, closes out part 1, where we were focusing in the book about fly casting. and shifts us over to part 2. In this case, it's the presentation and 61 tips to help you place and drift your flies so the trout want to eat them. So that's what we'll pick up next podcast. All right. So this is episode 3 where we talked to tips 41 to 45. Episode 4, we're going to be starting with part 2 and talking presentation, talking to the 61 tips that they're offering from the Little Red Book of Fly Fishing. And I'm not sure how far we'll get next round, but I hope you'll stay tuned. But for now, let's go and shift over to questions and answers. All right. Let's see. For the first question that had popped up, well, it's in fact the only question I got in the past few days since I last hosted this, was a question concerning the Suzuki 2.5 horsepower kicker motor that I use for my little John boat. The question was concerning when the individual puts the outboard in gear, does it kick? And he had just picked up a new one not too long ago. So the answer I gave, yes, it does kick, but I typically put it in a low idle before I do so. Individual also indicated that when he was trying to idle it, it seemed not to idle so quickly or at a lower RPM. Pretty much sounded the same as if he was on high as well as low. And what I mentioned is there is at a 10-hour break-in period where you need to give it a good solid 10-hour before you start cranking it. And once you do that, I noticed I was able to idle at a lower RPM. All right, so that was the one question that we had since we last met. All right, now let's go shift over to some recent happenings, okay? Just recently, I went over to Waterloo. I posted that one in a Let's Talk Fishing update, and here I was just having some fun, closing out 2023 with 2 trout, and I was able to cook that up for dinner. They did just want dry flies. I was trying to test out this squirmy tail nymph, and, well, they didn't really want that. They wanted to hit on the surface for some dry flies. That said, some upcoming things to keep in your back pocket. January 2nd, that's when TRWD and Texas Parks and Wildlife stock some more trout at the Clear Fork of the Trinity. So if you have the opportunity to make it there, I suggest you do. Additionally, Leela, Lake Louisville Ecological Learning Area was stocked as well. And hey, maybe reach out and let me know how it went, because over the years, the city of Louisville augments that stocking with some pretty nice trout. So I'm hoping we'll get some good reports of how the bite was doing there. And then finally, January 7th. That's going to be this coming Sunday. Waterloo. Just as the video that you're seeing here, or for those that are listening on the podcast, I got a video of that last trip to Waterloo Park Pond. It's getting stocked again. It actually is going to get stocked either Friday or Saturday. But the 7th is when they're officially notifying everyone, because on the 6th there's usually a trout derby the Saturday before. So you have the opportunity to make it up there. Go check out the papers. Denison's a small pond. It's great for kids to start out learning how to do some trout fishing. And in the video I'm showing, you can see that there's a lot of greenery on the bottom that'll clobber your bait or your rig. So I highly suggest to either put it under a float and sink it down there, or set up a Carolina rig, put some power bait on there, start 2 to 3 feet, and adjust from there to see if you can get them to bite. Other than that, you should have a good time over there at Waterloo Park Pond this upcoming weekend. All right. So with that, that closes out the Real Cast Fishing Podcast, Little Red Book of Fly Fishing Series, Episode 3. Stay tuned for Episode 4. That'll take you through Part 2 of the Little Red Book. And I'll continue with this format with going over the tips, answer some questions and answers, and then give you some recent happenings, fishing related, of course. All right. All for now. Next time we'll catch y'all later. And good luck and good fishing.